Good day, students. Today we'll be doing unemployment rate and we'll be continuing the slides from chapter 2 and then we'll go on. If you recall, in the previous lesson, we said that unemployment rate is basically us measuring the number of people in total to the total population, right, of or to the total working force that are unemployed. So we are looking at the people that are of working age, that are able to work and want to work, but unfortunately cannot work, right? So that is basically it. So here in this lesson, we'll be delving into the calculations that have to do with unemployment rate. So here are the explanations. Employment is the number of people who have a job. Alright, unemployment is the number of people who don't have a job but are looking for one. Labor force is the sum of employment and unemployment. And these are the definitions we basically expect from y'all, right? So labor force, this is basically how you calculate it, and this calculation is very important because you will use it when calculating unemployment, and I'll show you just now. All right, so unemployment rate is basically equal to the unemployed over the labor force, but usually they don't give you the labor force, and it's something that you have to calculate. So in this calculation, you'd say unemployment is equal to unemployed over unemployed plus employed, right? So in a situation where your employed people is 50 and unemployed people is 100, labor force would be 150, right? So how would you calculate your unemployment? Unemployment would be the 100 from the unemployed, right, over the 150 from the labor force, right? And that would be 50 over 150, and that should give you one third, which is about 33.3%, right? So yeah, they basically talk about the current population survey, and they explaining the people that are not included in the labor force, right? So who are the people that are not included in the labor force? Remember, we said the labor force is basically your employed plus your unemployed, right? So who is not included here would basically be the people that are discouraged workers. So, what do we mean by discouraged workers? It is a person that has been unemployed, right? But however, they're not looking for a job. So, if you're not going to seek for a job, then why should we then say you are unemployed? Because yes, you might be physically working, you might be physically able to work, but you don't want a job because you're not actively looking, right? So when we say discouraged workers, we're referring to the people who have given up looking for a job. So these are the people like maybe they matriculated in 2012, right? And they've been looking for jobs since 2012, and then maybe in 2016 they decided to give up because they had no luck in finding a job. Those people are discouraged workers, and we wouldn't consider them in the employed in the unemployment calculation because they basically sort of are not really active like that, right? Participation ratio or participation rate is basically the ratio of labor force to total population of working age. So it's basically the employed plus the unemployed, right? Divided by the total working age, right? So this is divided by the people who are between the ages, I think in South Africa, 18 to 64. Then we move to the next slide, right? Why do economists care about unemployment? Remember back in high school we did factors of production, right? And we say that labor is a factor of production, in that we need labor to produce things or produce goods and services in the economy, right? So when we have a high rate of unemployment, it means that we are not using our labor effectively, right, or efficiently. So there it is. It is a signal that the economy is not using human resources efficiently, right? And it's also a problem because it could, but having very low levels of unemployment would mean that we would have labor shortages. But I'll explain this in our contact lessons. And yeah, then this basically is a graph explaining the unemployment rate in the USA from the 1960s right till 2018. Right, so you will see that during world expansion, right, which is around this area or this period, we had unemployment rates that were not so high, right? We had between 5, or rather between 3 and 9%, right? And then you will see that here in 2009, which is when we had our financial crisis, it shot all the way to about 10, 11%, right? And that just shows you that that was a very tough period for the economy, right? And then the effects of unemployment on happiness. So this is a question that you might get, right? And just how to answer it is to answer it using logic. If people are unemployed, right, what is the effect on happiness? Definitely, if people are unemployed, there's going to be less happiness, in the sense that when people are unemployed, they have no income coming through. And when they have no income coming through, they obviously cannot afford to buy the things that they want and need. And that will cause a huge or a very high level of unhappiness, right? So, yeah, they say that being unemployed leads to large decreases in happiness. The happiness declines before the actual unemployment spell, and happiness does not fully recover even 4 years later. Right. Then we move on to inflation rate. So we've been talking about inflation, right, for the longest of time. So inflation is basically when you bought bread for 11 rand and now bread is 15 rand, or now bread is 20 rand. That is inflation. But what is the actual definition, right? The actual definition is that it is a sustained rise in general level of prices, or it's a sustained rise in the general price level. Right. Inflation rate is the rate at which the prices increase. Right. So what do we mean by that? It is basically us calculating that if we have bread for 20 rand now and we had bread for 15 rand back then, right? We're gonna say the 20 rand, which is the new price, minus 15 rand, which is the old price, divided by 15 rand, which is the old price, right? Times 100, and you'll get um your figure. That is basically the inflation rate, right, that we will be dealing with. And then deflation, right? So inflation is increasing, deflation is decreasing. So this is basically a sustained decline in the price level, right? And then we go to GDP deflator. So GDP deflator, we basically use it to get your real GDP, because sometimes your real GDP is not given. So when you're given your GDP deflator and your nominal GDP, right, you can use it to calculate your real GDP. And I'll show you how in just a few. So GDP deflator is basically the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. So the GDP deflator is equal to the nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Remember, nominal GDP is the GDP that changes with an increase or decrease in prices. Well, whilst real GDP is the GDP that stays constant, right? No matter or regardless of the fact that prices are increasing, right? So, it is also called the index number, right? And the rate of change has a clear interpretation. So rate of change or rate of inflation is basically your GDP deflator in the current year minus the GDP deflator in the previous year divided by the GDP deflator in the previous year, right? And I've always said this, but I'll say it again. Whenever we are calculating a change, it's always a no divided by old. So it's new minus old divided by the old. Always. That is the rule of thumb. Then we go on to this, right? When you are given your GDP deflator, right, you can calculate your nominal GDP or your real GDP. And this is how. You would say your nominal GDP is equal to the GDP deflator times your real GDP. But if we calculate in real GDP, then it will be your nominal GDP divided by your GDP deflator, right? And then, yeah, you can read through these slides. It's really not hard. Or and then yeah, so this is basically showing the inflation rates using the consumer price index and the GDP deflator, right? So you will find that usually your CPI inflation is higher than your GDP deflator inflation, right? And yeah, that is basically the general assumption, right? Then we go to pure inflation. Pure inflation, number one, does not exist at all, no matter what, right? So it's basically when your wages increase at the same rate as your inflation. So, for example, if your inflation was to increase from 5% to 6%, right, that is a 1% increase, right? And then that would mean if we have a pure inflation system in the economy, right, it would mean that our wages are also increasing by 1%. And now, realistically speaking, that is impossible. It will never happen because in most economies, yes, they might try to increase the wages, but they'll never really increase the wages at the same rate as inflation, right? And basically, whenever there is pure inflation, what it would mean is that consumers are not really affected because whether there's an increase in inflation or not, remember that their wages are also increasing, so meaning that they can also still afford to buy the things that they would like to buy. So yeah, that would basically be it, that real wage would be unaffected. Real wage being the wage measured by goods, right? The wage that we are able to, or the wage we use to acquire goods rather than the actual money, right? So why do we care about inflation, right? So a couple of lessons back, I say that as economists, when we are looking at the health of the economy, we look at three things, being the GDP, the unemployment, and the inflation, right? So this is why we care about it, because it tells us the health of our economy. Number one. Number two, it helps us determine if we are meeting our macroeconomic objective of having equitable or equitable distribution of wealth and income, right? You will remember that in your economics one, you discussed that one of the macroeconomic one of the macroeconomic objectives is to have equitable distribution of wealth and income, right? And then the slide reads the base rate of inflation is between 1 and 4%. But in South Africa, our target rate is 3 to 6%. And it's very important to remember that because they might just ask it as a 1 mark question in a test or exam. So please do note that. And then this basically is Okune's law, right? It's basically telling us or the relationship between unemployment rate and output growth rate. So as you will see, right, the graph is sloping downwards, right? So that just tells us that we've got a negative relationship between the two, right? So as you increase your output growth rate, you will see that your unemployment rate will decrease. And what do I mean by that? Think of it this way: when we have output growth, it means we are producing or having more production in the economy, right? And if you recall, we said that for us to produce anything, we need laborers, we need work, right, to be done by people. So if we're producing more, we're gonna employ more. So what does that mean for unemployment? The more we employ, the less the unemployment. And that is basically what is is being depicted by this graph, right? Then, yeah, that is basically Oken's law. It states that unemployment and output growth rate have a negative relationship, or they've got an inverse relationship, in that when unemployment increases, output growth will decrease, and vice versa. So, and then we go on to inflation and unemployment rate, right? It is also downward sloping, showing that there's a negative relationship between the two. How so? When we have unemployment that is higher than normal, right? Think of it in the sense that there's less incomes in the economy. So it doesn't make sense to increase the price levels, because who's gonna afford the goods, right? So just think of it that way. But remember that basically, when unemployment increases, your inflation will decrease, and vice versa. And that is basically summing up our Phillips curve. So Oken's law has to do with output growth and unemployment, and then Phillips curve has to do with unemployment and inflation rate. Then we go on to the short term, long term, and medium term. You can read that. And yeah, this is basically it for chapter 2.